From the JAMA Network, this is JAMA Author Interviews. Conversations with authors exploring the latest clinical research, reviews, and opinion featured in JAMA.
Hello, and welcome to our listeners around the world. Thank you for joining us today for this European Society of Intensive Care Medicine Special Edition JAMA podcast. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, and I'm the editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA Network. I'm joined today by Dr. Chris Seymour, who's an intensivist at Pittsburgh, an associate professor at JAMA, and the editor of our Caring for the Critically Ill Patient series at JAMA. We're going to be discussing 4 papers published in JAMA today to coincide with their presentations in the Hot Topics session at the ESICM meeting, October 9th, 2024, in Barcelona, Spain. These papers ask important questions. Does a stricter transfusion strategy improve neurologic outcomes in patients with acute brain injury? Can remote intensivists intervene virtually to provide care that reduces ICU length of stay? Does an extracorporeal blood purification device reduce the risk of acute kidney injury after cardiac surgery? And how can clinicians optimize weaning ventilated patients? Hello, Chris. Let's get started talking about these papers.
Hello. It's great to be with you. It's a big day with some great papers to talk about.
Yes, it's always exciting. Before we start, I have to say that it is exciting. This is the last session of the ESICM meeting usually, and I've been at this meeting. There are usually lots of people in the room excitedly waiting for these presentations, and it's nice to have 4 to talk about.
Yes, let's get into the new data.
Okay, so let's start with this paper, a restrictive versus a liberal transfusion strategy in patients with acute brain injury, transfusions in brain-injured patients, a randomized trial. This is from Dr. Tacconi and colleagues. Tell us about this trial. What is it about? Why is it important? And what did the authors find?
Sure. So this is also going to be called the TRAIN trial.
Okay.
And I think you said it. It's the transfusion trial. And there's been a number of these in the past decade or so. This one's focused on patients with acute neurologic injury, specifically TBI, subarachnoid hemorrhage, or intracranial hemorrhage. And it's looking at whether the target hemoglobin value is going to make a difference in really the long-term functional outcome of these patients. And the research in this area has had us lean towards a more restrictive strategy in the critically ill since the TRIC trial many years ago. But what these investigators did was say, well, let's do a multi-center trial here and actually see whether a higher transfusion threshold might be more beneficial. Hypothesizing that, oxygen delivery may be improved with red blood cells in the context of this impaired autoregulation that's happening in the brain injury. Okay, so 72 sites, 22 countries, 850 anemic patients with brain injury, and the 2 arms were a liberal, meaning targeting hemoglobin greater than 9 grams per deciliter, or a restrictive strategy of 7. The primary outcome was this Glasgow outcome scale extended, and ultimately what they found was that there was a significant decrease in the unfavorable outcome in the liberal strategy, 62% versus 73% in the restrictive. And this was similar in their subgroups. And what's really interesting is that this is very similar to the finding of the Hemotion trial, which was published just a few months ago in the New England Journal of Medicine. Another RCT that was showing likely benefit of a more liberal strategy for transfusion in this patient subset.
So it sounds like there is this trial that is suggesting a liberal transfusion strategy, but the way I've heard you describe it compared to the body of literature, this is perhaps an unexpected finding compared to the earlier trials that suggested more restrictive strategy would be better.
It's certainly different than the prior data, but many of the other trials had a broad case mix, and so they weren't enriched for the population with acute neurologic injury. And that was part of the rationale for designing these trials in this way. I think it's great that the signal is consistent with the Hemotion trial. There's another trial called Sahara that we'll see shortly. And it likely is going to influence how, I might practice and others are going to practice in our neurologic ICUs.
Wonderful. Well, we have a nice editorial that accompanies this trial. Shifting balance of the risk-benefit of restrictive transfusion strategies in neurocritically ill patients is less, still more. And the lead author of that editorial is, I believe, the investigator of the Emotion trial, Dr. Turgeon. And so very interesting discussion. And it sounds like something that has the potential to really change practice. And so that makes it quite important. Let's move to the second article. So this is effect of the Tele ICU on clinical outcomes of critically ill patients. The subtitle is The Telescope Randomized Clinical Trial by Dr. Pereira and colleagues.
All right, this is another good one. So if you've been in a hospital at any point in most high-income countries, there's likely some technology that's being used to monitor you beyond just the bedside monitors. And that is hopefully there to help the doctors, the clinicians, the nurses, and other members of the clinical team provide better care. In particular, in sort of the technology-rich environment of the intensive care unit, there's thought that a tele solution may actually improve our adherence to guideline care and improve the outcome of patients. This has been studied as well for many decades using observational data, quasi-randomized trials, or before-after experiments. But this paper and the investigators from Brazil here conducted a randomized trial, and that is what makes this really interesting. And so this group conducted an open-label, pragmatic cluster RCT from 2019 to 2021 across 30 general ICUs from public hospitals, primarily in Brazil. And they were testing a multi-component intervention, I think the core of which was Tele ICU. And so there was both personnel and hardware involved here, where a remote board-certified intensivist was available to conduct multidisciplinary rounds in the ICU on Mondays through Fridays, and then also promote evidence-based practice, performance indicators, and evidence-based protocols in these patients. They gave recommendations, and this intervention was then compared to just the usual care in that ICU when there was no tele-intensivist available. I'll point out that this was a very large trial, so more than 15,000 patients, 67,000 patient days were studied, and they have some fantastic information on adherence or not to the intervention, which has been missing from a lot of the prior data. The authors report that, the average interaction of the tele-intensivist with each patient was about 8 minutes, and on average in the unit was about an hour a day. And that of all the recommendations that sort of tele-critical care team was given, about, 5 recommendations per patient, 74% of those were accepted. So they did a great job monitoring adherence. But what was interesting is that their primary outcome of this trial, ICU length of stay, actually didn't differ between the groups. 8 days versus 7 days. And this was consistent even with their secondary outcomes. So it brings up a lot of questions. Tele ICU is used widely. And there's the hypothesis that particularly in resource-limited countries, this might be a solution. But the questions after this trial would be, was this used in the right ICUs? Was it the right intervention? Was adherence too low? Was it an unblinded trial? And did that sort of lead to the neutral finding? So it's a beautiful trial, and we have a lot to talk about.
That sounds really great. Yeah, there's also a very nice editorial that accompanies this trial. And as you note, this is a very large trial that I think provides interesting information for an important topic. And the authors of the editorial, Dr. Vranas and Dr. Khan, really explore what we learn and what it means for the future directions in their editorial, evaluating complex technological innovations in critical care, current challenges, and future directions. Let's move on to number 3. This is blood purification and cardiac surgery, acute kidney injury. And this is from Dr. Perez Fernandez and colleagues, looking at extracorporeal blood purification and cardiac surgery.
Yeah, so this trial sort of continues the theme of technology and what new devices and opportunities are there to help our critically ill patients. And they focused in on cardiac surgery patients It's a common procedure, and many of these patients are at risk for acute kidney injury postoperatively. Somewhere between 10 and 40% meet acute kidney injury criteria. And many of these may progress on or even develop chronic kidney disease. Okay, so in the past, our field has tested a variety of devices to, purify the blood and draw down the bad humors. But more specifically, in this case, our investigators were testing a device that sits in the cardiopulmonary bypass circuit and is seeking to remove non-specifically the inflammatory mediators during cardiac surgery. And then they ask, well, does this device, if used in the OR, affect the rates of AKI in the 7 days after the case? Now, it was a 2-center trial in Spain, a modest size of 340 patients, but they were getting complex cardiac surgery with CABG as well as valve replacement. And in the end, they found a positive result, that the rates of AKI in the 7 days after surgery were on average 10% lower in the intervention group than in control. And this was mostly driven by acute kidney injury in the first 48 hours.
Very good. Yes, I learned a lot in the editorial from Dr. Liu that accompanies this trial, because this is something where there's literature in the sepsis literature about this intervention, but thinking about it in the context of cardiac surgery, it's a positive trial, but also has some nuances in the finding with regard to the overall implications. So it's another interesting area. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. Let's talk about the last study. This is frequency of screening and spontaneous breathing trial techniques, a factorial randomized trial from Dr. Burns and colleagues.
Okay, great. Our last trial. So this is known as the FAST trial, and it's brought about sort of a different phase of critical care, and that's how we remove support from our patients instead of providing support right up front. And in particular, how we go about removing mechanical ventilation. Now, weaning from ventilators has been studied for decades, and we have really important trials that have taught us how to go about protocolizing the weaning of patients who are on ventilators. But yet, there's still quite a bit of variability in practice and unknown questions. And this was actually highlighted by Dr. Burns and her group last year in JAMA, where they showed wide variation across many countries in what ventilator mode was used to wean the patient, and as well as how often patients are screened for those weaning trials. So after that epidemiologic work, they've moved on and are now reporting results from this trial. Now, the design is interesting. It's a factorial design in which groups were randomized to either screening for weaning eligibility once a day or twice a day. And in the other factorial arm, they were randomized to either a pressure support weaning trial or TPs. Now, the authors hypothesized that these two arms did not interact, and they wanted to ultimately look at whether mode or frequency of screening was associated with a faster time to successful extubation. Now, as they conducted this trial in 797 patients, they found no effect in the primary analysis comparing pressure support versus TPs on time to successful extubation, and no effect on that outcome for the frequency of screening once versus many times during the day. But when they looked at the contrast of the four possibilities, they uncovered that using pressure support and screening once daily actually reduced the time to successful extubation compared to the other strategies. This finding was significant, and it's something we probably need to look at in future trials.
Yeah, very interesting. And it's one of those pieces that come out because of the way they designed this trial as a factorial trial. There's a very nice editorial here from Dr. Webb and colleagues, Ventilators, Weaning Strategies, Managing Interaction Between Randomized Treatments. And I think what's nice about this editorial is that it speaks to both the design of this trial and how it allowed the authors to really explore the interaction between these two types of interventions and the importance, what it might signal for clinical practice, as well as future studies. So lots of good science coming out of ESICM and really wonderful studies and accompanying editorials that we hope that our listeners and ultimately our readers will find informative for their practice. Thank you all for listening. You will find links to these articles and their corresponding editorials in this episode description. To follow this and other JAMA Network podcasts, you can visit us online at jamanetworkaudio.com or search for JAMA Network wherever you find your podcasts. I'm Dr. Kirsten Bibbins-Domingo, and I'm really pleased to have had this time with Dr. Chris Seymour. This episode was produced by Daniel Morrow at the JAMA Network. Thank you for listening.